Sophia stands in line at a small grocery store, holding a basket with a few basic items she doesn't really need, and she feels a strange tightness in her chest as she watches the cashier laugh with the customer in front of her, because something about that ordinary interaction reminds her of how disconnected she has become from simple moments. And she thinks about how her life used to feel full of noise, plans, conversations, and emotional urgency, and how now it feels reduced to routines, notifications, and polite exchanges that never go deeper than surface level comfort. And she reflects on how the last serious relationship she had ended not with a fight, not with betrayal, but with gradual emotional silence. Two people slowly becoming strangers while still sharing the same space. And she realizes how similar her current life feels: functional, calm, predictable, but emotionally distant, like she is coexisting with her own existence instead of participating in it. And as she pays and steps outside into the evening air, she feels an unexpected sadness, not because anything is objectively wrong, but because nothing feels genuinely alive. And she understands that the most unsettling kind of loneliness is not being alone, but being surrounded by life while feeling internally absent, present in every place but disconnected from herself, quietly waiting for something to make her feel real again, without knowing what that something is or whether it will ever arrive. Sophia walks home from the grocery store with the small plastic bag cutting into her fingers, the street already half dark, and she notices how automatically her body moves. The same route, the same buildings, the same internal silence she carries every evening. And she thinks about how little energy she feels, despite the fact that nothing physically exhausting happened. And when she enters her apartment, she drops the keys into the bowl by the door, leaves the bag on the kitchen counter without unpacking it, and sits down on the edge of the couch, still wearing her jacket. And this moment feels strangely heavy because it's the exact same way she's been coming home for months, sitting first, pausing, staring at nothing in particular before doing anything else. And she realizes how rarely she actually feels present inside her own space, how her apartment feels more like a waiting room than a home, a place where time passes, but nothing really happens. And as she finally takes her phone out of her pocket, not out of curiosity, but out of habit, she opens her photos and starts scrolling. And only then she notices the contrast between the life she remembers and the one she's living now. The way her days used to feel filled with conversations, plans, emotional urgency, and now feel reduced to movements between locations, tasks without emotional weight, interactions that never require anything real from her. And sitting there with groceries still untouched, she understands that the most unsettling part is not loneliness, it's how easily she has adapted to it, how normal this emotional flatness has become, and how she no longer knows whether she is resting, hiding, or slowly disappearing inside a life that looks completely fine from the outside. Sophia finally unpacks the groceries, placing the items into the fridge one by one, moving slowly, not because she's tired, but because everything feels strangely mechanical, and she notices how even her own movements feel disconnected from intention, like she's completing tasks without actually inhabiting them. And she thinks about how often her days follow the same pattern: work, commute, errands, scrolling, sleep, repeat, and how rarely anything interrupts that cycle with genuine emotion, curiosity, or presence. And as she closes the fridge and leans against the counter, she remembers the last time she felt truly excited about something, not in a dramatic way, just the simple anticipation of looking forward to a person, a conversation, a weekend. And she realizes she can't pinpoint exactly when that stopped, only that at some point, anticipation was replaced by maintenance, by keeping things stable, predictable, and emotionally safe. And she reflects on how her last relationship ended the same way, not with conflict, but with gradual silence, both of them too polite, too tired, too careful to admit they were no longer emotionally engaged. And standing alone in her kitchen, she feels a quiet recognition that her current life mirrors that same pattern, functioning, calm, orderly, but emotionally distant. Like she's coexisting with her own existence instead of actively participating in it. And this thought lingers, not as panic, but as an uncomfortable clarity, the kind that doesn't demand immediate action, but refuses to let you go back to sleep inside your routine. Sophia sits at the small kitchen table eating dinner in silence, the same meal she's been making variations of for weeks, and she notices how quiet her apartment feels. Not in a peaceful way, but in a way that makes every sound more noticeable. The hum of the fridge, the ticking of the clock, the distant traffic outside. And she realizes that this silence has slowly become the dominant presence in her life, something she once associated with rest, but now recognizes as absence, the absence of conversation, spontaneity, emotional friction. And as she chews without much appetite, she thinks about how rarely she talks out loud anymore, how most of her communication exists through messages, reactions, and brief exchanges that never require emotional involvement. And she remembers how she used to come home excited to tell someone about her day, even when nothing important happened, just because sharing made it feel real. And now she feels like her experiences dissolve the moment they end, unshared, unprocessed, not even noticed by herself. And this realization feels quietly heavy because it reveals that she is not missing people, she's missing participation, the feeling of being part of her own life instead of simply observing it pass. And sitting there with half-eaten food, she understands that loneliness is not always about being alone. Sometimes it is about living without emotional witnesses, without anyone, including yourself, truly acknowledging that you are there. After dinner, Sophia leaves the dishes in the sink and sits back on the couch, telling herself she will clean them later, even though she knows that later usually means tomorrow. And this small habit feels symbolic in a way she can't ignore. The constant postponing of simple actions, the way her motivation has softened over time, not collapsed, just faded into something quiet and passive. And she opens her laptop without a clear purpose, scrolling through old emails, unfinished documents, random tabs that were left open days ago. And she notices how many things in her life exist in this same unfinished state, conversations that ended without closure, plans that were never confirmed, dreams that were never formally abandoned but slowly neglected. And she remembers how she once had strong opinions about what she wanted, where she was going, who she wanted to become. And now those ideas feel distant, not because she failed, but because she stopped checking in with them, stopped asking herself difficult questions, stopped allowing space for dissatisfaction. And as she stares at the screen, reflecting her own tired face, she realizes that the most dangerous part of emotional numbness is not that it hurts, but that it doesn't, that it makes everything feel tolerable, acceptable, and therefore unchangeable. And this thought lingers as she finally closes the laptop, understanding that she is not trapped by circumstances, but by her own comfort with emotional neutrality, with living a life that doesn't feel wrong, but doesn't feel alive either. Later that night, Sophia lies in bed scrolling through social media, watching fragments of other people's lives pass in front of her eyes. Smiling faces, travel clips, relationships documented through soft lighting and captions about gratitude, and she feels a familiar disconnect. Not jealousy, not bitterness, just a quiet distance, like she is watching a world she once belonged to but no longer actively participates in. And she notices how effortless it seems for others to narrate their lives, to assign meaning, milestones, and emotional highlights, while her own days feel unrecorded, blending together without clear markers. And she reflects on how rarely she creates memories now, not because nothing happens, but because nothing feels emotionally significant enough to remember. And this realization unsettles her more than loneliness ever did, because it suggests she is not just alone, she is slowly becoming invisible even to herself. And as she puts the phone face down and stares at the dark ceiling, she feels a subtle anxiety, Not about missing out on experiences, but about missing herself inside them. About living so carefully, so quietly, that one day she might wake up and realize she has been present for her life only in the most technical sense. The next morning, Sophia wakes up before her alarm, not because she feels rested, but because her mind is already active, quietly listing responsibilities, deadlines, messages she needs to answer, tasks that exist more in her head than in any real schedule. And she lies there for a few seconds, staring at the pale light coming through the curtains, noticing how familiar this feeling is, the sensation of being awake without actually feeling present, like consciousness has returned, but motivation is still somewhere behind. And she reaches for her phone again, instinctively, not out of interest, but out of habit, checking notifications that don't really matter, opening apps she doesn't enjoy, filling the first moments of her day with noise so she doesn't have to confront her own thoughts. And as she finally gets out of bed and stands in front of the mirror brushing her teeth, she barely recognizes the person looking back at her. Not physically, but emotionally. The face feels neutral, controlled, functional, like someone who knows how to behave, how to survive, how to maintain stability, but has forgotten how to feel deeply, spontaneously, unpredictably. And she thinks about how her younger self used to wake up with anticipation, even on ordinary days, used to imagine futures, possibilities, emotional narratives that made life feel meaningful, even when nothing special was happening. And now those inner stories have been replaced by logistics, by managing energy, by avoiding discomfort. And as she puts on her clothes and prepares to leave the apartment, she realizes that her biggest fear is not failure, not heartbreak, not loss, but continuation. The idea of living the next 5 years exactly like the last five, emotionally safe, externally stable, internally absent. And this realization stays with her as she locks the door behind her, understanding that something inside her is quietly demanding change, not loudly and not dramatically, but persistently, like a signal she can no longer pretend not to hear. On her way to work, Sophia stands in the subway surrounded by people whose faces all look slightly distant, tired, absorbed in their own inner worlds. And for a moment, she feels strangely comforted by this collective silence, the shared unspoken agreement that everyone is moving, but no one is really arriving anywhere emotionally. And she watches her reflection in the dark window between stations, distorted by motion, and it feels symbolic in a way she can't ignore, like her identity has become something fluid, undefined, shaped more by schedules and expectations than by actual desire. And she thinks about how rarely she asks herself what she wants anymore, not in practical terms like career or finances, but in emotional terms. What kind of conversations she misses, what kind of connection she craves, what kind of life would make her feel awake instead of efficient. And this question feels almost foreign, like a language she once spoke fluently but has slowly forgotten. And she remembers how she used to romanticize small things, long walks without destinations, late night talks, getting lost in music, feeling emotions intensely even when they were painful. And now she feels like she has trained herself to avoid intensity altogether, choosing calm over depth, stability over truth, predictability over aliveness. And as the train approaches her stop, she feels a quiet resistance inside, not against going to work, but against continuing to live in this emotionally minimized version of herself, realizing that numbness was never a solution, it was just a pause that lasted too long. Later that evening, after another day that looked productive from the outside but felt strangely empty from the inside, Sophia sits alone by her window, watching the city lights slowly turn on one by one, and she realizes how similar they are to her own life, always functioning, always visible, always active, yet emotionally distant. And she thinks about how long she has been waiting for something external to shift her, a new job, a new relationship, a new environment, believing that change must arrive from the outside in order to justify how she feels. And she understands now how subtle that illusion was, because what she has really been avoiding is the responsibility of acknowledging her own emotional absence, of admitting that nothing dramatic happened, no major trauma, no catastrophic failure, just years of choosing comfort over honesty, routine over curiosity, emotional safety over emotional truth. And she feels a quiet grief for the version of herself who once felt deeply, loved intensely, expected more from life not because she was naive, but because she was present. And as she sits there listening to distant traffic and her own breathing, she recognizes that awareness itself is already a form of change. Not the loud kind, not the kind that posts on social media or announces itself through bold decisions, but the kind that slowly shifts the way you inhabit your own thoughts, your own emotions, your own time. And she knows that tomorrow will probably look similar to today. The same alarm, the same train, the same routines. But something fundamental has moved inside her, a quiet refusal to continue living unconsciously, a gentle commitment to start paying attention again, to notice what feels empty, what feels heavy, what feels alive, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it disrupts the stability she built. Because for the first time in a long while, she is not asking for a different life. She is asking to finally be present in the one she already has.